Washington, D.C., November 14, 2023. My name is Ethan Graves, and I am a condemned man. I don't make this statement lightly, but after what I've witnessed, I know my life hangs by a thread. If you're reading this, it means I either managed to escape, or perhaps I wasn't so lucky, and someone found these words, my account of the horrors hidden beneath the most protected building in the world. This document is my last hope that, even if I disappear, the truth won't be buried with my body. And before I go on, you need to know this. The United States government is hiding secrets far beyond our understanding, and one of those secrets is alive. The day that changed my life began like any other, or so I thought at the time. I work at the Pentagon, and the routine there tends to be predictable to a certain extent. Endless meetings, discussions about military strategies, reports arriving from various parts of the world that demand quick responses, but nothing that ever truly changed my day. I'd grown used to this rhythm since I was hired as an analyst for ultra-secret operations. My role is to ensure that the flow of information between different agencies is flawless and that nothing vital escapes the national security net. To most people, the Pentagon is seen as the command center of the planet's most advanced military operations, an almost mythical place. But for those of us on the inside, it's different. The Pentagon is a gigantic bureaucratic machine, slow, almost impersonal. It's a place where the highest levels of security coexist with the most tedious tasks. However, that morning, something was off. As I prepared for another workday, something unusual appeared in the system. It was a file that shouldn't have been there. Project Abyss. In fact, I'd heard that name before, but always in hushed conversations and tense glances exchanged among senior colleagues. I never knew exactly what it was about, but the very name, Abyss, carried a weight that left me uneasy. I assumed it was an error, a system anomaly, that is, until I clicked on the file. At first I hesitated. I knew that opening a classified document without proper clearance could cost me dearly, but there was something about the name, something pulling me, almost like a magnet. Curiosity overpowered caution, and before I knew it, my fingers were pressing the key to open the file. Little did I know this would be the first of a series of wrong decisions. When the file opened, I was faced with a collection of fragmented reports, all referring to an entity. There were also vague descriptions of experiments conducted in an unknown sector, somewhere deep beneath the Pentagon. The language was technical, almost cold, but there was something between the lines that made me deeply uncomfortable. It was as if those words were infused with something that wasn't meant to be read by ordinary eyes. Terms like containment and existential threat appeared repeatedly. There were mentions of a discovery made during a clandestine mission in the 1940s. They spoke of a living artifact, something brought back from a secret expedition. Whatever it was, it seemed like something that had already spiraled out of control. Before I could fully process what was in front of me, my computer shut down, as if the system had detected I was accessing something I wasn't authorized to see. Panic overtook me. I had crossed a dangerous line. The hours that followed were unbearable. Every minute dragged as I waited for a reprimand or, worse, for armed guards to come for me. I knew accessing something like Project Abyss wasn't a small mistake, yet strangely, nothing happened. At least, not immediately. It wasn't until that night, as I was leaving the Pentagon, that something even stranger occurred. I received a message on my phone. It was from an unknown number, and the content was short but direct. Meet in the basement. Room 47, 11 p.m. A chill ran down my spine. I knew this wasn't a good sign, but at the same time, the curiosity that made me open the file now pushed me to follow through. Exactly at 11 p.m., there I was. The Pentagon's basement is a labyrinth of narrow, dimly lit hallways, guarded by silent security officers. But room 47 was unlike any other place I had seen there. It was in a forgotten wing, almost as if it had been designed to remain hidden. The air was heavy, as if the very structure was weighed down by decades of accumulated secrets pressing against the walls. When I finally arrived, a man I had never seen before, dressed in an immaculate black suit, opened the door and invited me in. Inside, 3 people were watching me. The kind of stare that pierces through your skin and goes straight to your soul, as if they already knew all the answers before I even opened my mouth. In the center of the room, sitting with the rigid posture of a high-ranking military officer, was General Roswell. He had a well-established reputation, a man with decades of service and a reputation for being utterly ruthless. "You accessed Project Abyss, didn't you?" Roswell's voice was calm, but there was an implicit threat that didn't escape me. Before I could deny or come up with any excuse, he continued, "I need you to understand something, Ethan. What you saw can't be ignored. Now you're part of it, whether you like it or not." Nervousness consumed me. My hands were sweating and I could barely process what was happening. The general's words echoed in my mind, and I knew, deep down, that something far more profound and dangerous was at play. Roswell then began to speak of something that seemed too absurd to be real: the existence of an entity, something inhuman, hidden deep within the Pentagon. His explanations were filled with technical terms, references to military experiments involving the paranormal, dimensional distortions, and the manipulation of forces beyond human understanding. As he spoke, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "She's no longer fully contained," he said, his voice taking on a nearly ominous tone. "She's growing stronger, hungrier." I could hardly believe what I was hearing, but the look on Roswell's face was serious, determined. He wasn't telling a story to scare me. He was revealing the greatest secret of the American government. "And we need you," he concluded. "You've seen too much. There's no turning back now." In the nights following that meeting, my life turned into a nightmare. At first, I thought it was just nerves, the fear of being involved in something far beyond what I had imagined. But then, the dreams began. Or were they nightmares? It doesn't matter what I call them. When I finally managed to sleep, my mind was invaded by disturbing visions. I dreamt of an infinite abyss, surrounded by eyes watching me from within the darkness, while voices whispered things I couldn't fully understand. When I woke up, I felt a presence in my room, something that shouldn't have been there. Roswell, true to his word, gave me access to an observation room located in the deepest layers of the Pentagon's basement. It was a cold, inhospitable place, where a series of monitors displayed images from cameras installed in a completely isolated sector of the building. It was said to be where the entity was confined. My first glimpse of the beast, as some called her, was through one of those monitors. The camera was black and white, and the image was distorted, as if the mere presence of the thing interfered with the equipment. At first, all I saw was a shadow, a dark blotch that seemed to have no defined shape. It moved slowly, almost as if it were waiting for something. Its form, or whatever it was, seemed to be in constant flux, as if it could never fully stabilize. But the real terror wasn't just in its appearance. It happened when one of the technicians entered the containment room to perform some kind of maintenance. He was wearing a special suit, as if dealing with a form of dangerous radiation. As soon as he crossed the door, the cameras began to fail. The images became grainy, and then something changed. The technician stopped in the middle of the room. His breathing, which was audible through the microphone, became increasingly erratic, as if something were squeezing his chest. Then, suddenly, he froze, and I heard it, a breath. Not his, but something else. Something deep, guttural. It was her. It was the beast. The darkness on the screen moved. Slowly, almost as if savoring the moment, the shadow approached the man. Even through the screen, I could feel the power of that being, its hunger, its overwhelming presence. The cameras failed for a few seconds, and when the image returned, the man was no longer there. What I saw was not just a physical creature. It was something that distorted reality around it, something that manipulated people's minds, corrupting their perception. And at that moment, I knew I had crossed a point of no return. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew I was involved in something much bigger than any conspiracy or military secret. We were dealing with a force that transcends our comprehension, something that should never have been confined, something that was about to break free entirely. As the days passed, I began to notice subtle but disturbing changes around me. It wasn't just my colleagues who seemed different, tenser, more nervous. The very atmosphere of the Pentagon was changing. The shadows seemed longer, the lights flickered more frequently, and the air felt heavier, harder to breathe. It was as if the building itself was being influenced by the presence of that thing deep within. But what terrified me the most were the sounds. During the night, as I walked through the empty corridors, I swore I could hear whispers. They weren't clear voices, and I couldn't make out any words. But they were there, always present, lurking. The entity was affecting us. It was breaking through the barriers of its confinement. The nightmares became more frequent and more intense. In my dreams, I found myself falling into an endless abyss, surrounded by eyes watching me, voices calling my name. When I finally woke, I felt a presence in my room. It wasn't just a sensation. It was real. Something was there with me, something that shouldn't have been in that place. The air grew cold, almost freezing, as if it were being sucked away by an invisible presence. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I couldn't just ignore what was happening, but I couldn't tell anyone either. Who would believe me? Who would believe that something supernatural, something incomprehensible, was lurking in the halls of the Pentagon? One night, while working late, I heard a strange noise coming from one of the corridors leading to the basement. It was a metallic sound, like something scratching against the concrete floor. My curiosity drove me to investigate. When I reached the corridor, I found Mark, one of my colleagues. He was standing in the middle of the hallway, his back to me, his shoulders tense, his hands trembling. "Mark," I called, but he didn't respond. As I got closer, something about his behavior made me suspicious. His eyes were glazed over, lifeless. His mouth hung slightly open, muttering something I could barely understand. "She's coming. She's coming." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was something in his tone that chilled me to the bone. It was as if he wasn't there, not anymore. It was as if he was being controlled by something, or someone. When I tried to touch his shoulder, he didn't react. I kept hearing the same murmured phrase, while his eyes fixated on a distant point, something I couldn't see. My heart raced, and that's when I heard it. A sound coming from somewhere at the end of the hallway. A soft scratching, like something slowly dragging itself across the floor. It wasn't the sound of human footsteps. It was something deeper, something far more sinister. The air around us seemed to grow thicker, heavier, and a sense of dread gripped me. I knew I shouldn't be there. The lights began to flicker, oscillating between total darkness and blinding flashes. With each flash, it seemed like something was moving in the shadows, something I could only catch glimpses of for fractions of a second, always closer, always more menacing. Mark remained there, frozen, murmuring the same phrase, while the sound of something approaching from the hallway grew louder. It was as if that thing was hunting us, stalking us. I was paralyzed by fear, fighting the urge to run. I knew that if I made any sudden movements, whatever was lurking in the shadows wouldn't hesitate to attack. Then, I heard it again. It wasn't just a scratching noise, but a low, guttural growl that reverberated inside me. I quickly turned around, looking for something, but there was nothing, or at least, nothing my eyes could see. With my heart pounding and my terror growing by the second, I slowly backed away from Mark, who remained motionless. And then, without thinking twice, I ran. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, without looking back, while the sound of that thing, the scratching on the floor, the growling, chased after me. The lights continued to flicker frantically, creating a strobe effect that made it difficult to distinguish what was real and what was a product of my imagination. All I knew was that I had to escape. I had to get out of there before it was too late. When I finally reached the surface, my legs were trembling, my body drenched in sweat, and my breathing was ragged. I was out of my mind, trying to process what had just happened. But one thing was clear. Something was terribly wrong at the Pentagon. Something far beyond any military secret. Something involving the entity that Roswell had mentioned. Something that was breaking free. In the days that followed, Mark's behavior became one of the main topics of conversation among our colleagues. No one knew where he was. Some said he had taken an emergency leave. Others suggested he had been transferred to a secret mission. But I knew the truth. Mark hadn't been transferred. He had been taken. Whatever was breaking free in the depths of the Pentagon had corrupted his mind, turning him into an empty shell, at the mercy of the beast. I knew I needed answers. Each day, things seemed to get worse. The Pentagon, with its always busy corridors, now felt like a darker, more sinister place. The people around me were acting strangely, with vacant stares, as if they knew something, but couldn't talk about it. The atmosphere, once just bureaucratic and impersonal, now seemed charged with an invisible tension, something surrounding us that no one dared to mention. I needed to know what was happening, and Roswell was the only person who could give me the answers I was seeking. So I returned to room 47. "I warned you there would be no turning back," were Roswell's first words when I entered. He was sitting at the table, his expression serious, his eyes fixed on me. "Mark, what's happening to him?" I asked, trying to stay calm, but the tremor in my voice was unmistakable. Roswell leaned forward, his fingers drumming methodically on the table. "He got too close," he replied. "The beast, as we call her, isn't just an entity. She has the power to corrupt the reality around her, influence minds, distort perception. Mark was just the first, and you, Ethan, are already being affected too." I recoiled instinctively, panic rising within me. "What do you mean by affected?" I asked, almost whispering. Roswell gave a faint smile, but it was an empty gesture, devoid of any empathy. "You felt it, haven't you? The cold, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. She feeds on fear, on confusion. Every time you perceive her, every time you try to understand her, she gets closer. She's shaping your reality." My mind was on the verge of collapse. This couldn't be real. I was just tired, stressed from work. But deep down, I knew. I knew Roswell was right. I had already felt all of it. The cold that crept through the corridors, the whispers in the dead of night, the feeling of being watched by something invisible. The beast was affecting me, warping my perception, distorting what was real and what was a projection of her power. "What is she?" I asked, almost breathless. Roswell stood up and walked over to the window, looking at the reflection of the room in the fluorescent lights. He remained silent for a few moments, as if searching for the right words to tell me what I already feared. "Something that was never meant to be found," he finally said, his voice heavy with the weight of responsibility. In the 1940s, the U.S. government, amid the paranoia of the Cold War, conducted a series of secret expeditions in search of technologies and powers that could secure an advantage against our enemies. One of those expeditions led our scientists to a remote location in Siberia, where they found a portal, not to another dimension, as we tend to imagine, but to something older, something that existed before time, before our understanding of reality. They brought what they found back here, to study it, to use it as a weapon, but they didn't know what they were dealing with. Roswell turned to me, his eyes darker than ever. "The beast doesn't belong to this world, and now she's breaking free." My nights grew even more disturbing. Every time I closed my eyes, I fell back into that endless abyss, surrounded by the creature's eyes, by the voices that seemed to pull me into something much larger than I could comprehend. The Pentagon, with its long corridors and extreme security measures, now felt like an illusion of control. Something was happening in the depths, something far older and more dangerous than any secret the government could hide. I could no longer distinguish what was real from what was a product of my imagination. My colleagues, the people around me, seemed to act strangely. There were whispers everywhere, vacant stares, and erratic behavior. Conversations were abruptly cut off, as if everyone knew something they couldn't speak out loud. I knew I was being affected. I knew the beast was getting closer, shaping my mind, corrupting the reality around me. And I knew I had to act fast, before it was too late. That's when Roswell called me for one last mission. "We're going to Sector 0, he said, his voice firm, but with a note of resignation. "We need to face this head on." Sector 0 was a secret area, located in the deepest basement, where the entity was supposedly contained. At least, that's what they believed. I knew that wasn't true. The beast was no longer confined. She was spreading, corrupting everything around her, and soon there would be no way to contain her. I descended with Roswell and 2 other agents. The elevator that took us down seemed to descend for hours, while the air around us grew denser, colder. The sensation of absolute dread grew with each passing second. When the elevator doors finally opened, we were faced with Sector 0. It was a massive chamber, its walls covered in strange symbols and electronic devices that pulsed with a faint light. In the center of the room, shrouded in dense darkness, was her. The feeling of being in that place was indescribable. It was as if reality itself was starting to disintegrate around us. The air was heavy, charged with something malevolent, something that seemed to watch us from every corner. The darkness at the center of the room seemed alive, a pulsating mass that swallowed any trace of light around it. And then I saw her, not with my eyes, but with my mind. The beast was there, waiting. She had no discernible form, but her presence was overwhelming. She moved slowly, as if waiting for something, or someone. Roswell, who had seemed unshakable until that moment, began to breathe irregularly. He walked over to a panel covered in runes and advanced technology, and without saying a word, he began activating a series of commands. "We don't have much time," he said, breaking the suffocating silence. "This is our only option. The beast can't be destroyed, but we can contain her. For a time." But something went wrong. As Roswell activated the controls, the darkness at the center of the room began to stir violently. The beast was reacting to the attempt to contain her. The air grew denser, almost impossible to breathe, and then came the sound, a deep guttural growl, as if the very earth was screaming in pain. We all felt it. It was a vibration that shook our bones, making them tremble. Suddenly, the creature lunged forward, expanding in all directions like a wave of liquid darkness. Roswell shouted something I couldn't understand, and then the lights went out completely. I stood there, trapped in a darkness that seemed endless. For a few seconds, there was no sound, no movement, just complete emptiness. I tried to move, but my legs were paralyzed, frozen by fear and the crushing pressure of that environment. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. Everything around me was suffocated by the beast's presence. It was as if I were floating in space, disconnected from any sense of reality. Then, the darkness began to stir again. Unintelligible whispers echoed around me, coming from all directions. They weren't human voices. They were distorted sounds, as if lost souls were calling out to me from within the abyss. And soon, I realized something even more terrifying. I was no longer in the room. The ground beneath my feet was soft, muddy, as if I were in some kind of swamp. The walls, if there were still walls, were distant. A faint glow appeared in front of me, and I instinctively followed that light, the only source of guidance in that hellish darkness. As I moved forward, I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone. It was the screams. Not ordinary screams of pain, but screams of pure despair, as if the souls damned to hell were being torn apart. With each step I took, the sound grew louder, more piercing, as if it were happening all around me. "Ethan." I heard someone call my name, but it wasn't a familiar voice. It was deep, distorted, as if it came from inside my own mind. I looked around, desperate, but there was no one. I was alone in that unknown place. The feeling that the beast was playing with me was unbearable. She was trying to break me, to reduce me to a pile of pure terror. That's when I saw something in front of me. In the midst of the fog that now formed, a figure began to take shape. For a moment, I thought it was Roswell, but when the figure came closer, I realized I was wrong. The person's face was contorted, melted, as if it had been deformed by an unimaginable force. The eyes were black holes, without expression, and the arms stretched out toward me. I instinctively recoiled but stumbled and fell onto the muddy ground. The figure moved closer and closer, its whispers growing louder and more frantic, until in a surge of desperation, I stood up and ran. I ran without looking back, not caring where I was going. All I knew was that I needed to escape that thing. I ran for what felt like an eternity, or so it seemed. The fog around me was thick, distorting everything around me. There was no direction, no escape. The only thing I knew was that I was being hunted. When I finally stumbled and fell again, my breathing was labored, and my body felt on the verge of collapse. It was then that I heard a familiar voice. "Roswell! Ethan!" he shouted. "This way!" Somehow, amid the chaos he had survived, I got up, panting, and followed the direction of his voice. I found him leaning against a concrete wall, the only solid structure in that hellish darkness. His face was dirty, but his eyes were more alive than ever, shining with a mix of fear and determination. "What's happening?" I asked, panting. "Where are we?" The beast pulled us inside her. "Ethan," Roswell said, his voice grave. "This isn't the Pentagon anymore. It's her world. She's keeping us here, breaking us." I looked around, desperate. The environment seemed like a distorted reflection of the Pentagon, as if the building had been sucked into a nightmare. The walls were twisted, like pulsating flesh, and the constant sound of something moving in the shadows was unbearable. "How do we get out of here?" I asked, with no hope in my voice. Roswell looked at me with a tired expression. "I don't know. Maybe there is no way out." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. The man I believed to be relentless now seemed broken, a reflection of our own helplessness. We were trapped in the heart of darkness, and with each passing second, the feeling that we were being watched grew more intense. Then I heard it again. That sound, the deep growl, coming from all sides. The beast was approaching, and this time she was coming to consume us completely. There was no more time to hesitate. Roswell and I exchanged a silent glance, and without saying a word, we started running again. There was no right direction, just the urgency to escape the thing hunting us. As we ran, the agonizing screams echoed again, as if we were being pursued by all the souls the beast had devoured over the years. But something was changing. The darkness around us seemed to be closing in, compressing itself into a single mass, as if we were being pushed toward the center of something much larger. The darkness around us seemed to have a consciousness of its own, shaping itself to trap us, confining us in a spiral of despair. With each step, I felt the crushing weight of the beast's presence watching us, as if she were merely enjoying herself, toying with our weakness. The air around us was so thick that each breath was a struggle, as if the oxygen were being sucked away by something invisible. As we ran, something changed in Roswell. He, who had been a rock of rationality until that moment, began to murmur to himself, as if trying to rationalize the irrational. The murmurs turned into disjointed words, and soon he began to scream in a tone of despair I had never imagined hearing from a man like him. "No, it can't be true. We released her. I released her." His confession came like thunder, and my mind went into shock. Roswell knew. He had known what was happening from the start. He, more than anyone, had been involved in whatever this horrible entity was. "What did you do, Roswell?" I shouted, grabbing him by the arm as we continued running. He seemed to be in a trance, but my words brought him back for a brief moment. We thought we could control her," he replied, his voice broken by heavy breathing. "In the 40s, when we found her in Siberia, we thought she was just a primitive force, something we could turn into a weapon. But we didn't know. We didn't know that she can't be controlled. She's not from this world, Ethan. She never was." Roswell's words cut through my mind like blades. All the reports I had seen, all the whispers about Project Abyss, were real. More than that, they were underestimated. The truth was that the U.S. government hadn't just found a being or any ordinary entity. They had stumbled upon something much older, something that transcends our reality. A cosmic predator whose hunger wasn't for flesh but for souls, for fear, for despair. As we ran through that endless maze of living darkness, the sound of the beast's growl grew louder, closer. With each step, I felt as though I were being pulled back, as if an invisible force was holding us to the ground, making our escape more difficult. Roswell was weakening. His legs were faltering, and his screams of terror had turned into moans, until he finally collapsed to the ground. "No, I can't go on," he whispered, falling to his knees. "She's inside me, Ethan. I've already been marked. I'm part of her now." I looked at him, incredulous. The man before me, who once seemed indestructible, was now falling apart. His skin was pale, his eyes vacant. It looked like the beast had already consumed his mind, leaving only an empty shell, ready to be devoured. "Get out of here," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Go, while you still can." I hesitated, but panic overcame me. I knew there was nothing more I could do for him. So with a heavy heart, I turned and kept running. Alone, I ran aimlessly through corridors that seemed to bend and shift as I moved forward. There was no more logic to the space around me. It was as if the world was molding itself to the beast's will, as if I were running inside her own twisted mind. The ground beneath my feet felt uneven, the air was thick, and each breath was harder to draw. At one point, I saw a faint light in the distance. It was dim and flickering, but it was the only sign of anything beyond the darkness surrounding me. The hope that the light might signify an escape gave me a burst of energy, and I ran with all the strength that was left in my body. As I got closer, I realized that the light came from a door. But it wasn't an ordinary door. It was a stone arch, covered in ancient symbols I didn't recognize, symbols that seemed to pulse with their own energy. The light emanating from within was bluish, cold, almost icy. When I crossed the arch, I was immediately engulfed by a feeling of vertigo. The world around me seemed to twist and spin. What I saw on the other side wasn't an exit. It was a portal. On the other side, a vast plain stretched out, devoid of any life or vegetation. The sky was covered with black clouds, and the air had a burnt smell, as if the very atmosphere were dead. On the horizon, indistinct shapes moved, shadows that seemed to contort and change form, as if the very space was alive. I shouldn't have gone through that portal. Immediately, I felt that something was terribly wrong. The beast wasn't just confined to that underground room at the Pentagon. Whatever it was part of a much larger ecosystem, a parallel reality that existed somewhere between our world and something much, much older. Project Abyss had been a colossal mistake. They hadn't simply unleashed a dangerous entity, they had opened a connection to a plane of existence that the human mind wasn't meant to comprehend. This can't be, I whispered to myself. This isn't possible. I tried to go back, but the portal behind me had vanished. I was trapped in that place, surrounded by an incomprehensible void, with the overwhelming sensation that I was being watched by thousands of invisible eyes. The sounds around me were distorted, echoes of screams and whispers blending with the ghostly wind that swept across the plain. My mind struggled to maintain any semblance of logic, but with each step I took, the reality around me unraveled a little more. Somehow, I knew I had crossed into the beast's domain. This was the true abyss. As I walked, trying to find any way out, the feeling of being watched intensified. Then, suddenly, I saw something in the distance. A solitary figure, walking toward me. As it approached, I realized it wasn't human. Its form was vaguely humanoid, but there was something profoundly wrong about it. Its skin was a bluish gray, almost translucent, and its face had no eyes, only a pair of empty holes. The creature stopped a few feet from me. I could feel the weight of its presence, an ancient horror that seemed to have rooted itself deep within my being. Then, without moving its mouth, it spoke directly into my mind. "You have entered her domain, human. Now, you belong to us." My legs gave out beneath me. I fell to my knees, feeling an overwhelming pressure in my head. It was as if all my thoughts were being ripped from me, my very identity being devoured. The beast, or whatever it was, wasn't just an entity. It was a living force, capable of eroding people's very essence. I fought against it with everything I had. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. I tried to run, but my body was frozen, paralyzed by terror. The void around me seemed to close in, trapping me, suffocating me. Then something unexpected happened. The figure in front of me, which I had believed to be a servant of the beast, began to disintegrate, turning into dust before my eyes. A wave of energy rippled through the air, and the portal that had disappeared before now reappeared in the distance, flickering on the horizon like a mirage. I knew it was my only chance. With the last of my strength, I stood up and ran toward the portal. Each step felt like an eternity, while the darkness around me shifted, as if trying to pull me back. I could hear the beast everywhere, her growls and whispers echoing through my mind, promising eternal suffering if I fell into her grasp again. When I finally reached the portal, I dove through it, without hesitation. The sensation of crossing back was like being pulled out of the water after nearly drowning. My whole body was exhausted, my mind shattered. I collapsed onto the cold floor of Sector 0, gasping for breath, feeling the air around me return to normal. but still with the terrible sensation that something had followed me back. When I stood up, Sector 0 was empty. Roswell was no longer there. The agents, the scientists, everyone had disappeared. The Pentagon, in a deathly silence, seemed completely abandoned, as if time had stopped since the moment we crossed into the portal. I made my way up through the empty corridors, my legs trembling, feeling the persistent sensation that I was being watched. The beast might have been contained again, for now, but I knew she was still there, waiting. And the most terrifying part was that now, she knew who I was. When I reached the surface, I found a world that continued on as normal, indifferent to the terror hidden deep beneath the Pentagon. But I knew the truth. I knew that the beast wasn't just a dark secret. She was a living threat, a force that would one day break free entirely from her chains. And when that happens, there will be no turning back. So I write this account as my final act of desperation. Perhaps I won't survive much longer. Perhaps the beast has already marked me. But if someone finds these words, let them serve as a warning. The U.S. government is hiding something far worse than any human conspiracy. The real threat doesn't come from outside, but from the abyss they themselves opened.